Hello, my name is Owen Clayton. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Leeds. I've been for the last 4 years completing my thesis on 19th century American and British literature. During most of that time I've been teaching undergraduates here at the University of Leeds. I've also taught at the University of Lincoln and also at Hertford College, University of Oxford. And also for much of that time I've taught at A-level and at GCSE as well. So I've been able to get a cross-section, to see a cross-section of educational levels, and during much of that time I've been able to see the gaps that are there in the educational system, the kinds of things that students don't actually pick up as they move through the educational system. And that has led me to create the lecture that I'm going to give you today. Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about how to create effective arguments. Now, what is an argument? Okay, an argument, if any of you have seen the clip from Monty Python, which is the argument clinic, you will know that an argument is not simply two people disagreeing. In fact, in that very clip, one of the characters says that an argument is a collective series of statements to establish a definite proposition, that it is an intellectual process. That is a very accurate description of what an argument is. An argument is something that you build up through your essay in each of your paragraphs. The paragraphs are the building blocks, if you like, of your essay, and they work to establish your conclusion. Okay, so this lecture is going to discuss three topics, and the first of those is going to discuss introductions and conclusions. And introductions and conclusions are vital in terms of thinking about your argument. Your introduction is the place where you actually establish your argument, you establish what you're going to say. And then we're going to look at structuring your argument, and it's important to recognise that arguments actually have a structure. And then the final part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about common argumentative flaws. And that part of the lecture might get a little bit technical, but whenever I use technical language, I will try to explain what I mean by that. Okay, so let's look at introductions and conclusions first. Okay, so what do introductions and conclusions do? Surprisingly enough, they introduce and they conclude. Well, okay, what do good introductions and conclusions do? Okay, well, a good introduction, I think, does three things. A good introduction, first of all, goes straight to the topic, it defines the terms, and it arouses interest. The second thing that an introduction does is it signposts the way ahead. The third thing that an introduction does is it provides background. I would say the first two of these are vital. The third is advisable but not absolutely essential. But I would say that the best introductions, and I hope that you want to write the best essays you possibly can, would include all three of these aspects. Okay, so how do we do these? Let's look at the first one. So let's look at going straight to the topic, defining the terms, and arousing interest. Now, going straight to the topic, that is about being assertive in what you say. It's about leaving the nitty-gritty of your argument, the subtleties, the complexities of your argument, to later on, to the actual main body of the essay. Okay, so otherwise you'd end up with a very long, a very wordy introduction. Defining your key terms. Now, defining your key terms is very important because you might, in your question, have key terms that might potentially be defined in different ways. Different people might think of different key terms in different ways. Let's give an example. Say you were talking in your essay about love. Okay, you're looking at a particular poem and you're looking at the function of love. Now, love is something that can be defined clearly in many different ways. It's romantic love, filial love, sexual love, and so on. So you would have to define what exactly you meant by that term for the purposes of your essay. And what you need to do is not just to define a term, but to say how you're going to use that term. Okay, so the definition of that key term is actually important for your argument. Okay. Now, arousing interest, this is a snappy first sentence that you have. This is perhaps a general statement about the topic, which just gets your reader's interest when they're first turning the page. Okay. Let's give an example of the kind of introduction that does the things that I'm talking about. Okay. So this is an example from a fictional essay, and it's an example from an essay in which a student has been asked to talk about the function of ideology in Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations. Okay. So this is our example introduction, and let's go through this. So ideology, like oxygen, is necessary yet invisible. Okay, so there's your kind of snappy first sentence, if you like. It's a general statement about ideology, about the fact that it is everywhere and yet invisible, and it's comparing it to oxygen. So it's a kind of general statement trying to arouse interest. It's a little bit arty. You can have a little bit of fun with it. Okay, let's move on. In Capital, Marx gives this description of an ideological act. We are not aware of it, nevertheless, we do it. Okay, so there's your definition, not exactly of ideology, but of an ideological act. Okay, and it's taking it from Das Kapital by Karl Marx. Okay, moving on. Utilising Marx's definition, this essay will argue that the main characters in Great Expectations engage primarily in ideological acts, of which they are unaware, but which their ideology compels them to undertake. Okay, so that is using the definition of ideology as seen in Marx's Das Kapital and saying that you're actually going to apply that specific definition of an ideological act to Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Okay, so it's not just defining your key term, but it's also saying why that definition of your key term is important and how you're going to use it. Okay, so the second thing that a good introduction does is it signposts the way ahead. And it's important to say that this is, you can think of this like a roadmap, okay? So this is just saying the order in which you're going to discuss certain aspects of the essay. Okay, so let's turn to our example introduction again. And this will be the next sentence following on from the introductory sentences that we've already seen. Okay, in order to do this, I will examine the actions of Pip, Joe, Magwitch and Wemmick in turn. Now, for those of you that have not read Great Expectations, those are characters from Great Expectations. So, simply put, the essay is going to examine each of those characters' actions in turn, and is going to use each of those characters as, if you like, paragraphs. So that is the structure of the essay laid out in the introduction. Now, there are certain things maybe missing with this introduction at the moment, but we'll come to that when we turn to thinking about common argumentative flaws. Okay. So the third thing that we said that a good introduction does is it provides background. Okay. Now, providing background is important because it shows that you have read around the topic. It establishes your credibility as a writer, as a young scholar. Okay. It shows that you've actually looked around the topic and that you therefore know what you're talking about. Okay. Now, background can take different forms. You could have historical background, contextual background. So if it was a Victorian novel, you might look into that. It could be biographical information about a particular author, about Charles Dickens' life. It could be critical background. So this could be giving some of the critical context. How have critics received the novel Great Expectations? Okay. Now I said that this wasn't absolutely essential to provide background, but I think the very best essays will do this, so it's highly recommended. So let's look back at our introductory paragraph again and see how it continues. The mid-19th century was a period of enormous social change. The Industrial Revolution reinforced the boundaries between classes, while at the same time perpetuating a bourgeois ideology of individual achievement. Okay, let's stop there for a second. So what we've got here is an opening couple of sentences which provides a little bit, in a very general way, of contextual information for the mid-19th century, which is when Great Expectations is written. Okay, so it's a period of enormous social change. The Industrial Revolution, which creates a working class in which people are working in factories, but it also creates what's called a bourgeois class of people who actually own those factories. So you have an increasing, if you like, a stratification of society into those two different classes. It becomes much harder to move from one class, from the working class, up into the bourgeois class. And yet at the same time, there is an increasing ideology of individual achievement, which suggests that you can actually achieve whatever you want as long as you work hard, no matter what class you're born into. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. Let's move on to the next sentence. This meant that there was often a contradiction between the actions of particular groups and the justifications for those actions. Okay, so this is where you see that, this background actually relates to the definition of an ideological act, which we had at the very beginning that we took from Marx. So the background is relevant to the definition of ideology because there is a contradiction potentially between what people do and why they think they're doing certain acts. Okay. So let's move on. We're going to talk now about good conclusions. What do good conclusions do? Okay, well, I think good conclusions do two things. A good conclusion finishes firmly and sums up. Okay, and if possible, a good conclusion also notes further questions. And I would say that number one is vital and number two is advisable. So again, if you want to get have the very best conclusion and write the very best essay, it's best to have both of these things. But number one is absolutely vital. Okay, so how do we do these? Okay, well, number one, summing up and finishing firmly. Well, this is about, simply put, it's about stating what you've said in the essay. Okay, so in the introduction you say what you're going to do, in the conclusion you say what you've done. So the conclusion is synthetic, not in the sense of being artificial, but in the sense of a synthesis, in a sense of bringing things together, bringing all the different strands together, and actually making it clear that you've reached your conclusion as a result of the paragraphs that the marker has read leading up to that point. And your conclusion should arise organically from your paper. Okay, so there should be no surprises hidden in your conclusion. The marker should not get to the end and think, oh, that wasn't the conclusion I expected. Okay, it should actually seem fairly obvious to the marker by the time they reach your conclusion that that's what your conclusion was going to be. Okay, well, partly because you'll have already said it in your introduction, but it should make sense and it should arise organically out of the paragraphs and out of the arguments that you've made all the way through the essay. Okay, now finishing firmly, this is the counterpart, if you like, to the strong opening snappy sentence. This is a good strong sentence to finish up at the end, and various methods that people use to do this. You could rework a famous phrase potentially, or use a quotation, or make use of a quotation from the text itself. There's various different ways you can do that. Okay, so what are some common errors that people fall into in their conclusions? Well, I've kind of hinted at one of them already. A very common error is to say that you have proven something in your conclusion that you haven't actually proven in your essay. Okay, so students often get to the end of their essay and you get to write your conclusion and you think, uh-oh, I haven't actually proven what I said I was going to prove in my introduction. Well, never mind, if I just say that I have in my conclusion and it's what I said in my introduction, never mind, no one will notice. Well, surprisingly enough, people will notice. Markers are people who, are tutors at university who mark hundreds of essays. It's what they get paid to do. It's one of the things they do for a living. So surprisingly enough, they will actually notice if you do that. So if that situation arises, you realise you haven't actually proven your point, well, you might need to go back to the essay and rework certain aspects of it, or you may need to slightly change what you said you were going to prove in your introduction. Okay, a second problem that people often have with their conclusions it relates to the part where you're supposed to finish firmly, is that people quite often fall into preaching and they quite often make emotive statements like capitalism is evil or religion is rubbish or I hate Dickens. Now you might actually think one or more of those things, and in a sense I'm not too concerned whether you actually do think those things. The point is, well, okay, if you want to critique capitalism, well then you would need to do that, or rather you might want to talk about the ways in which Charles Dickens's novels critique capitalism, but you would do that in a measured way and you would use evidence from the text. Likewise, if you don't actually think that Great Expectations is a particularly good novel, well, okay, that's fine, but then you would need to provide evidence in the text as to why you would think that, and also as to why hundreds of years of scholarship are wrong as well, by the way. Okay, the second thing that a good introduction does is it notes further questions. Now, I said that this wasn't quite as important as the other aspects of a conclusion, but I think it's certainly something that you should think about doing, especially if you do actually want to have the very best conclusion possible. Now, noting further questions, students often take this to mean just talking about the things that you haven't mentioned in your essay. And it is that, but sometimes people talk about that in terms of, well, I just haven't had time to talk about X. And that can sound a little bit defensive. So my advice for this would be to talk about further questions that have arisen as a result of you doing your essay. Okay, so as a result of doing the research that is in your essay, there are now further questions. And one of the ways that you might express that is you might say, further research might examine ... and then say whatever it is that the further research might examine. And if you look in academic journals, you'll find that that's what most academics themselves do. And in this sense, your conclusion is a development of your introduction, okay? So you've actually moved on by the time you get to your conclusion. You're not in exactly the same place. It's not simply a past tense version of your introduction, okay? You have actually done something in the progress, as you progressed through your essay. That in a sense, there has been a point to what you've done. You've actually reached a point that was different to where you started from. So if you have a look in academic journals or in chapters in books, and you'll see how academics themselves do it. And there's certain techniques which people use which crop up again and again. So if you have a look in a journal and see how they introduce and conclude their own work, then you might be able to do that for yourselves.